Excellent. So with that stuff covered, the intro, so really what we want to do is talk through the current landscape, kind of get a general common talking point for where we are in the ransomware attack space. Talk a little bit about how these attackers are getting into environments like yours and actually carrying out some of these ransomware attacks. To be honest, there's a little bit of doom and gloom in that section, talking through some of those statistics and what those attacks are looking like. But we will get through that quickly and really start to focus on what you can do, both from a prevention and a detection standpoint, including a few things you'll be able to go back to your organizations today and start asking questions and making sure some of these foundational controls are in place. The slides will be made available to you, and there are links to additional resources in there. So all of the tools and techniques that we'll talk about today are freely available, and we do link to those, so you'll be able to follow up internally with those. All right, we can skip through the wolf. So from a current landscape front, what we're doing is pulling some information from the CrowdStrike Cyber Frontlines report. Some folks on the meeting today may be familiar with the Verizon Data Breach Investigations report, where Verizon looks at a bunch of security incidents each year and produces a report with some pretty good statistics coming out of that. CrowdStrike also does that. And the reason why I use them here is with the shift to remote and hybrid work, there's been a lot of focus on endpoint security as a whole. Now, all of a sudden, we've got all sorts of folks working at home from a laptop when historically, they may have been within a traditional corporate environment inside the walls of a castle, right? So now the attacks are first starting with these endpoints, and CrowdStrike, being the vendor that they are and the tools that they provide, has a lot of interesting insight. So a few things to look at here. More than half of these attacks were financially motivated. So that's probably not a big surprise. People are compromising sensitive information in systems to make money. It's not so much the hacktivist approach of trying to make statements or any destructive means for the sake of being destructive. They're doing it because they want to get paid. What's interesting is out of all of these financially motivated attacks, more than 80% of them were ransomware. So there could be everything else, from extortion or taking data to try and open up fraudulent lines of credit to make money that way. The vast majority has shifted to ransomware, and we'll touch on why that likely is in just a moment. Another important note here is that almost half of the incidents that CrowdStrike looked at, the antivirus tool failed to work, essentially. So either did not stop the malware or didn't trigger during a few stages in that ransomware attack. And the reason why this is important is clearly a large number of organizations are setting up their control environment with that single point of failure and placing a lot of trust in their antivirus or their endpoint security tool. And that unfortunately didn't work out well for them. What was also interesting here is the folks that did have some of these tools deployed, in almost a third of those incidents, either it wasn't installed on every endpoint. So what you can think of there is companies scrambling to deploy laptops. And I should note the data from the incidents here is covering the year of 2020 for the 2021 incident, hence the focus on kind of early stage COVID response information. But laptops being deployed, and maybe they forgot to put that security tool in place, or it wasn't properly configured. So maybe it wasn't reporting in to the management server correctly, or had rules that were overly permissive enabled. That's something that I think would have been somewhat of a struggle in a traditional approach, but adding in the complexities of shifting to a remote workforce clearly had a big impact here. And the last thing to note is almost 3/4 of the organizations that were studied as part of this report had a follow-up attack within a year. So this could be for a few different reasons. One of them, if you do happen to pay in a ransomware attack, they now know you're willing and able to pay once. Odds are pretty good you will the second time around. But also, it seems like folks aren't really doing that root cause analysis during that lessons learned phase of their incident response process and figuring out exactly what went wrong and trying to address that. So that certainly highlights an importance there. A few other things to know, about the business model that is this e-crime. So the concept of the big game hunters. So this kind of shifts how ransomware attacks have been working recently versus, the kind of early stages. Early on with a ransomware attack, you'd have someone on their endpoint get their C drive encrypted, and they'd get, a text file ransom note on their desktop saying, hey, all of your files have been compromised, pay us a few $100s to get them back. Really where the shift has gone is having a multi-staged attack against the enterprise and not just going after the first machine they get on, but really trying to understand where the sensitive data is in your organization and going after a much bigger data target, which then comes with a much larger ransomware, as well as a higher likelihood of payout. It's pretty easy to lose, an end user's C drive. Ideally, there's not anything mission critical saved locally that's not being backed up. But if they're going after a file share or some core systems, now there's all of a sudden a much bigger disruption to the organization, and it really turns up the pressure on trying to get you to pay that ransom note. Another interesting note here is, I mentioned, it is a business of e-crime, and with that comes specialization. So now you're not just seeing an attacker run the campaign from start to finish. Historically it would be a person or a group working, they'd identify some targets, try and find a vulnerability, try and attack you, and try and get paid. Now they're essentially specializing in each phase of the attack process and renting out or relying on third parties as attackers to perform that initial access into your environment. Or maybe they're really good at getting into the environment, but they're working with a third party to deploy and manage the ransomware process as far as executing the malware and collecting payment. And the last thing to note here is the attackers, they don't discriminate. So we've seen they're going after just about everyone. I think it was interesting with the Colonial Pipeline information. They kind of realized afterwards it was a mistake going after someone that important and causing that much of a disruption, because now all of a sudden they're getting a significantly larger amount of attention into who they are, how they're operating, and really combating that attack. But they really are going after everyone. It's not just the financial services industry. Certainly, a big target, but they really are going after everyone. And what they're doing is getting in and, like I said, identifying how the business operates. So not just compromising a user, but compromising the user and then moving throughout the environment, trying to understand what your operations look like. That way they can really get into make a bigger impact on your operations. All right. So as far as, what ransomware is, I'm sure folks on the call have heard ransomware more in the last year than they want. So this will be brief, but essentially breaking it down to a 5-step process at this point with this current ransomware process. So they are getting initial access. So this is either into an end user's laptop, PC, whatever it may be, maybe into an email account, or web applications have actually been a really big target in the last year for attacks. Whatever it is, they're getting access to some piece of your environment. From there, they're having to get execution right. So they need to be able to do something on the machine. There's a number of vulnerabilities where they may be able to, kind of get read access, which could be an issue, could be a data loss concern. But from there, they need to start to escalate privileges. And part of the benefit of that is then they're looking to access credentials. So what they want to do is not just compromise Sean, the standard end user, on his laptop, but they want to move from Sean and then understand who the IT person is that last logged into the computer, because they probably have higher rights. And from there, they want to start to move throughout the environment, getting past a single endpoint to those bigger data stores, both to be able to figure out what the environment looks like, but also to access more sensitive data. From there, that's when they're really executing their payload. And what is, I guess, the important point to note here is this attacker dwell time, which is really the measurement of time from that initial access point until you detect them, is lagging several weeks to months behind when they've actually conducted the attack. So if they're attacking on January 1st, most organizations aren't finding out until the late summer, if not later. And it's usually a third party telling them, we have evidence you've been compromised. You need to look into this incident. Obviously, with ransomware, that dwell time is going to be a lot lower. So if they're encrypting your files, you're going to know about that. But we have seen a shift where folks are not necessarily relying on ransomware alone, but dealing with exfiltrating some of that data, taking copies and using that as another factor, demanding a second ransom to say, not only might your files be encrypted on premise, but we also have copies. And if you don't pay this ransom, we're going to start releasing these. Okay. So with that, that's the high level overview. As far as getting into some of the technical aspects of what these are looking at, MITRE ATT&CK is really the #1 resource we've been pointing folks to really understand how these attacks are working. What this is, MITRE is a research group, and ATT&CK is one of the projects they've released. And what they do is track threat actors, so these different criminal organizations that are executing these large-scale attacks, to understand exactly what they're doing. So they're getting to the level of, here's the tools they're using, here are the commands they're executing. Here's how they're getting initial access to the environment. Here's the tool set they use to actually communicate with their own infrastructure during the attack. It gets really granular. At this filtering, this is actually displaying some information on the enterprise level. So they do break things down by mobile devices, Mac OS, Windows Enterprise, et cetera. At the Windows Enterprise level, they're tracking roughly 350 different techniques or individual tasks that threat actors have executed in well-known attacks. What is nice here is you can really start to slice down the data through both the techniques themselves, as well as the threat actor groups, to understand what techniques should you be worried about and where do you actually perform well in your control environment, where might you struggle. And what you can do is filter down these threat actor groups by just displaying, I want to see who is operating in the financial services industry. And then we can look at what those people are doing. You can also say which sort of groups are executing ransomware attacks. And let's understand if that's a little different. Are there other techniques we should be worried about? And this really helps you understand what your threat model may look like. And then you can start to build an informed control environment based off of that. I will note this is post-compromise focused. So there is some information around that initial access piece, but the vast majority is focusing on, once they're in your environment, what are they doing? And we're going to talk a little bit more about MITRE ATT&CK in a bit. So with that, how do they actually get access to your environment? So with this, there really are 3 different issues that we've seen as the most common way of getting access, and they generally do work together. The first one, probably not a surprise to the folks on the call, is phishing emails still have a very high rate of success. And what we're seeing here is not just the really basic phishing attacks, but they're getting more complex. It's not the case anymore where you can say, hey, look for typos, because phishing emails have typos or poor grammar, and then you can disregard those, right? At this point, they're getting much better. And people, honestly, for the last year and a half or so are more distracted. They're working remotely. Maybe they have other folks working from home as well. Maybe they have kids at home. They've got a lot of not work-related stress, on their mind as far as healthcare concerns or anything else. And when it comes to phishing, that's really all they're trying to do. It doesn't have to be the perfect phishing email. It just needs to be the right thing at the right time. And with new technologies being rolled out, oftentimes not being face-to-face, these emails do tend to seem a bit better and a bit more legitimate. The second item here in combination with phishing has to do with weak passwords, not just kind of weak passwords created by users, but also the technology controls in place that are allowing some of these things to exist. And then the third one being the misconfigurations in really common technologies, Microsoft 365 being a big focus here, where either things are left running as default, and unfortunately, many of the Microsoft settings were configured by default for operations, not necessarily security. And then, there's a lot of things that's not a direct shift of Exchange on-prem to now it's Exchange in the cloud, which some organizations, think it's basically a new technology with a lot of settings that need to be configured that you're not used to seeing. All right, so with that, phishing, the last thing, to note on here, not only was it, a big focal point around pandemic, anytime there's any sort of social event or anything going on, attackers are going to use that. And, we're already starting to see warnings go out about kind of the holiday season and Black Friday shopping scams and, all sorts of issues like that. They do go after, that timing issue where maybe you don't think, maybe it looks good enough to get you to click. The important thing to note here is phishing. We've also seen a big uptick in these being used to go after multi-factor as well. So both through industry best practice and some regulatory pressure, a lot of organizations do have multi-factor in place, if not for all remote access, at least for their privileged users. So the attackers now know they have to go after that, and they're starting to do so. It could be as simple as harvesting credentials and then sending a message with something like, hey, we're from IT, we're never going to ask for your password, but we're seeing some issues come up and we need to check out your account. I'm going to send you, a push notification to make sure that you're okay with me looking into this. We really want to make sure there's, nothing going on with your account that's going to hurt the company. Putting that pressure on the person that, okay, I remember my training telling me they'd never ask for my password. I'm not giving anything up. I'm just clicking okay on an app. And now all of a sudden the attacker is kind of off and running. So certainly a concern there. From the phishing email perspective, there's really not anything crazy going on. It's the same sort of things you look to see, in any other security awareness training. There's something in there to put a little bit of panic or social pressure on the recipient where, hey, I just need to act quickly. Trying to look legitimate as far as getting them to pages that seem to be like a Microsoft login page, but may or may not be, that legitimate website. And then moving on to the passwords, right? So the phishing, not a big surprise there, and there's not, a lot of new challenges in the technology there. Password spraying comes into play with those weak passwords. So what we've been seeing is, more and more folks are active and on social media like LinkedIn. And that really provides a lot of good information for an attacker to start targeting your environment. And what this generally looks like is going through a few different tools to say, I want to target Wolf. Show me every single employee that has Wolf listed as their employer. And what it's going to do is give you that first name, last name text list, essentially. And then you go to another tool and say, I want you to take this list of first names and last names and generate every, common corporate email format of first initial, last name, first name dot last name, last name dot first name, all the standard formats most organizations use. And now we've got a pretty decent idea of what these email addresses could be. Password spraying is taking something like spring 2021 exclamation point. Now we're in the fall, so we can just swap that out and they've met their 90-day password rotation and submit that for each of those usernames that we've come up with. And what they're doing is they're not sending every possible password against every username, because that's going to lock a lot of people out. You're going to know something's going on and be able to respond. What they're doing is sending maybe one or two passwords against these users. Most organizations have that setting of a password account lockout timer set to somewhere between 15 minutes and a day. So they know, there needs to be a bit of time between these invalid login attempts to avoid locking out the user. What they'll do is they'll be smart about when they're submitting these login attempts. So before folks start for the day, so maybe around 6 or 7 in the morning, you send a password spray, maybe 1, maybe 2, and then the person's going to come into work around 8 or 9 in the morning. And when they log in with their valid password, that timer gets reset to 0, and they can now submit another few password attempts before lunchtime. That person's gone. And then they come back around, 1 or 2 in the afternoon, and now they've logged in successfully again, reset the counter. You can now spray a third time. So you're at, a handful of password attempts against all these users without ever locking out the account. And that's within a single day. And unfortunately, a lot of times these passwords are successful. Season, year combinations, company names, local sports teams, anything like that, makes it really easy for the attacker to try and guess and gain some of that access. Once they're in, then it's just a matter of what sort of information is available in the email inbox, in OneDrive, in Teams. Can we use that to move to other users? Multi-factor authentication bypass is another kind of issue in how they're getting in. So a lot of folks have deployed multi-factor authentication. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is a lot of organizations didn't address some of the default options. So when it comes to that Microsoft 365 space, the 3 legacy authentication protocols listed here, EWS, ActiveSync, and AutoDiscover, do allow you to bypass all of your multi-factor authentication controls. So you can log in using a username and a password, regardless of what multi-factor authentication tool you use. You don't need that. And you can now access emails, documents, etc. These used to be enabled by default. Fortunately, if anyone is starting to consider moving to a Microsoft 365 environment, I do believe they've switched the default to not enabling these. But many organizations are still struggling to address these, and certainly something to be aware of. So if nothing else from today, if you've got Microsoft 365 or Office 365, make sure you do go back and ensure these 3 protocols have been addressed. Conditional access is another item related to multi-factor authentication. And what we're looking at here is essentially using some of that advanced technology to dynamically control what sort of authentication factors are required. So looking at things like the login source GUIP, so we have here Iran. Should Sean be logging in to check his email from Iran? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe it's, not that extreme example. Maybe it is, hey, Sean logged in from Massachusetts at 9 in the morning and then at noon tried to log in from California. That's kind of impossible travel, right? That's 3 hours later across the country. But you can set up these policies to, be smart. So maybe you do have an office or a VPN endpoint in both of those locations, and maybe that's not suspicious. But you can build out that ability to understand what are some of these suspicious login attempts and how do we want to react? Do we want to quarantine the user? Does it generate an alert? If it's generating an alert, does it rise to the appropriate risk level? Oftentimes we'll see things like this. Hey, it's enabled, but it's a low or an informational, maybe a medium risk, not something that is really setting off alarm bells when it probably should. What is nice is, we do note here, this is another one of the items that by default is enabled, but really does require a bit of work to make sure it makes sense for your environment. All right, so once they're in your environment, there's not a big surprise here. They're doing a lot of the typical ransomware actions as far as using infected documents to actually execute. But I mentioned they're also kind of crawling through information and working for that double extortion activity of trying to find some sensitive information to pull out of the environment. Can they find some customer, some member information in email attachments. Maybe they're going through loan files that has all sorts of personal information. Can they access any SaaS or third-party apps that your users use that might have sensitive information? They're going through that, and it's not just compromise the first user is really the big focus. They are trying to make a bigger impact on the incident. So with that, I swear that is the end of the doom and gloom. We'll talk about what you can actually do. The first thing here, probably a little bit obvious, but we talked about how big of an issue phishing is. User awareness is going to be the first kind of line of defense in that aspect. The items on the top half of the slide, you're probably, I should say, hopefully already doing through your security awareness training program. The standard how to spot a phishing email. Really what I want to focus on today is that bottom half of incentivizing some of this good behavior. So not only making it easy for users to report suspected emails or report if they've fallen for something, but not so much focusing on punishing folks that have fallen for a phishing email, whether it was a test or a legitimate one, but really highlighting the flip side of that. We've seen a lot of success with organizations doing things like email newsletters highlighting folks over the last month that have submitted suspicious messages into the security team, or raffles to say, hey, you know what, this over the last month we had 10 people report issues and we're doing a raffle for a gift card for them. And, the standard messaging, you're helping us stay secure. And what we're looking at is, more and more of these organizations have gotten, your standard, you're doing your own phishing testing, you're probably somewhere in the single digit percentages for fail rate. That's excellent. Once you get to that point, we really, recommend that you start shifting the focus to driving that reporting rate as close to 100% as possible. If you're getting down too low in that failure rate, folks are probably, kind of understanding if the messages are a little formulaic or templated. And what you want to do is focus on that reporting rate. So the concern is that maybe when that real phishing attack hits your organization, because it's going to, it happens all the time, you don't want people just saying, oh, this is IT, they're doing another phishing test, I'm going to delete it. Because there could be one person out of maybe the 5 that got that message that falls for it, and they don't know, it's a bad email, and no one reports it. So now all of a sudden they've given access either through credentials or they've opened a document or whatever they've done. And you, from an IT perspective, don't have any idea. You can't start your response process yet. So really making sure not only is the process easy for end users to submit it, but you're actually actively encouraging them to do so. When it comes to remote access, obviously we want to make sure that is being secured. So whether that comes through as a VPN configuration or things like Citrix or some of the CASB solutions, like Okta or any of the others, have you appropriately secured not only the authentication to those devices, but the data in transit itself, right? And making sure, especially with the recent FFIEC authentication guidance, understanding what the authentication workflow looks like for all of our systems. And is that appropriate? Have we identified which of these systems come through as either high risk or containing high risk users, or can any users execute high risk activities? And really making sure you've solidified that full workflow. Excellent. Some other things to note on remote access, some highlights here for you around conditional access and some recommendations, but making sure you are deploying those conditional access policies, and there are some recommendations here. Making sure that you are blocking that legacy authentication. Like I said, that I probably can't highlight that enough. Those 3 legacy authentication protocols are the biggest thing I've been yelling about for a bit, and will probably continue for a little while. Making sure that multi-factor authentication is enabled, and that you are making sure that you're monitoring what that user login process looks like. Are you identifying users trying to log in from suspicious locations? Do you have the ability to see that? And how are you actually identifying and reacting to that? Determine, what the requirements are. What you don't want to do is just say we've got multi-factor authentication, so we're all set, but you still have, a weak password policy that allows creation of things like fall 2021 exclamation point. Um, 2 weak factors are certainly better than 1 weak factor, but if you have not properly secured each step in that authentication process, you really do need to, take a look at that and make sure you're putting the technological controls in place to support a secure environment and not relying on a statement in a policy and then having end users, acknowledge, okay, I need to make strong passwords. You need to put the controls in place to make sure that they can't create some of those bad passwords. And one of the items there that we talk about a lot is with things like password rotations and hey, if we're going to make them have these super long passwords, can we not change them as often? And that comes up a lot. So the general guidance around that right now is NIST put out a really nice authentication guideline, NIST 863 B. And what they do there is provide not only guidance around multi-factor authentication, but with password creation as well. And really what we want to see there is a focus towards taking some of the responsibility off of the end user for protecting their password, right? We want you to create a strong password, but we also, here, we being the IT department, want to make sure we're doing things in the background to make sure that password stays secure. So there are tools that, will help you prevent the end user from using a password that's been disclosed in a breach. There are tools that'll help you get a bit more stringent in what that complexity requirement is to block things like fall 2021. And the general idea that NIST is trying to shift people to is getting away from the arbitrary password rotation of you need to change it every 30, 60, 90 days, and instead change the passwords when you know or you suspect the credential has been compromised. So if you think you fell for a phishing email, okay, that's a trigger for we should change this password. But from that risk perspective, if you're putting the controls into place in the background for IT to make sure users are creating strong passwords and we're monitoring for suspected compromise or abuse, you can shift that responsibility off of the end user and back onto the IT environment. Another important item to highlight here is endpoint security. So, I started off talking about how ransomware attacks are now really starting on the endpoint. More users have their endpoints exposed through these hybrid and work from home environments. And unfortunately, some of those statistics are showing that having that single point of failure can be a big issue, and they're not always going to catch anything. So making sure you are using appropriate endpoint security. I do list a few here, but certainly have no allegiance to any of them. They tend to be the big names that pop up. But the focus point is really more on the methodology of not relying simply on a signature-based detection of, hey, we've seen this file before, we know it's bad, we need to block it, but actually looking at what the files are doing on the end user's machine and starting to catch some of that malicious activity. And the other item here is, the asset management lifecycle, everything from identification to understanding what firmware and software is running on these endpoints. And this includes all of your IoT devices that continue to expand. There's smart thermostats, TVs, all sorts of displays, tablets, all these different things provide additional surface area for attack, and making sure that you know what's going on, both from a vulnerability perspective, as well as understanding what's going on at the device level itself. And final note here around data backup is following the 3-2-1 rule. So making sure that you've got 3 copies of any of these sensitive data types or data elements that you're worried about on 2 different storage media types, with at least one copy stored off-site. So this is, a large ask for any organization with, a number of users. So what you really need to do is identify which parts of your data environment really are, critical and would cause significant downtime. So thinking back to your BCP program of your RTOs and RPOs, what do we need to capture in this 3-2-1 backup strategy to make sure if we do, get attacked with some sort of ransomware attack, we'll be able to continue operating. Okay. So then the fun stuff that you can do once you've kind of got that basic, control foundation in place, what you want to do is come back to MITRE and start building out that additional control environment based on the threats you're likely to see. So what you see here on the page is a screenshot from the MITRE ATT&CK website. This is for the Wizard Spider group. The group themselves are not specifically special. The reason why I highlighted them is they were a well-known ransomware group. And what we can see if I bring my cursor up, this bottom third here starts to show you the exact steps that they were using in their campaigns as far as how they were getting access to environments, how they had their communication structure set up to continue moving throughout the environment, how they retained access, et cetera. So we can really understand what these folks were doing as part of their attacks. And then we can start looking at how do we stack up against these attacks. And the way we can really do that is through tools like Atomic Red Team here. So this is, again, another open source project. And what this allows you to do is hand select some of those techniques that MITRE is highlighting in that attack framework, and then run that on a test machine to understand, does our endpoint security tool block this? Yes or no? Does it generate an alert? Yes or no? And is that alert appropriate? And you can do that for each of your controls throughout your environment. So you've got the endpoint security. Maybe you've got local administrative rights controls around the endpoints. You've got Windows event logging. You've got web filtering you can test. You've got lateral movement detection. You've got a lot of different layers of controls in your environment that this tool really helps you start to test that and say, does this environment hold up the way we think it does? And if not, where are we softest that we need to start focusing on bringing some additional resources in. Another tool I want to highlight for you, another open source tool, is called Vector. And you see the little graphic here, right? It's a purple teaming tool as far as buzzwords go. So the red team being the people attacking your environment, and the blue team being the defenders. In this case, they're working together, and red and blue mixed together makes purple. I would like to say it's a threat emulation tool. It's, I think, a bit more representative of what you're doing. You're taking these techniques from some of these attackers and recreating them in a dedicated test environment. And what this tool allows you to do is start to color code and essentially grade yourself against that attack framework. So what you'll see here, the text might be a little small. That's not important. The color coding is what I want to highlight here. And what you're seeing is that MITRE ATT&CK framework of all those different attacker techniques filtered down to a specific threat actor. In this case, we're looking at some phishing domain campaigns, and then understanding how do we actually hold up against these controls. Green being, hey, we not only blocked it, but we also detected the event was happening. Red being, we didn't catch anything, the attack worked, we haven't heard any alerts, we hadn't, we didn't get anything. And then, the yellows and oranges being somewhere in between. And to give you just a quick example of what you're seeing here is getting down into the test level of understanding, were we able to detect this? Were we able to prevent the attack? And what do we need to do really to fix up this hole if it is something we're concerned with? The first question being, are we monitoring this specific endpoint? Because that's something we see often is, the event log process is, it's noisy, it's difficult to collect logs on all these endpoints. So people have either chosen to be really selective in the types of logs that you're monitoring, or just choosing which systems they will and will not monitor. So this tool can really help you piece that together. Another tool worth knowing about is called the Ransomware Readiness Assessment, and this is released by CISA. And what's nice here is they do take a tiered approach to the assessment, so you can really focus on what does your environment look like, and then based on that, let's take some appropriate steps to get better. So they're not saying you need to do everything on this list right off the bat. It gives you a nice roadmap of how to proceed. Right. The last tool I really want to highlight for you here is called MITRE Defend. So that is defend, but it's a 3 for an E. They are computer people, and they need to make themselves look like computer people. So what this is the NSA, with their primary responsibility being on computer system defense, saw a lot of the great work that MITRE ATT&CK was putting out with all of this attacker tracking, and said, hey, we can do something similar with a lot of our defensive knowledge. And so what they've done is they've put out this defend matrix. Again, the individual details here not being important, but what is nice to see is they essentially put together a 5-step process for defending an environment, starting with hardening your devices. From there, you want to be able to build out a detection landscape. The 3rd step being isolating any of those compromised items. 4th step being deceive, which is really getting to the level of an advanced control environment. This is things like honey tokens, honey users, essentially things that you want the attackers to target. So you make this super domain admin user account that no one actually uses, and it's configured to not actually be able to log into anything. But if you see that account attempt to log in, that sets off all sorts of alarms because people shouldn't be using that account. And then the final step being the eviction. So making sure the attacker is removed from the environment. What's nice here is it's similar to that MITRE ATT&CK framework where they've gotten really granular. And this is just a quick example where the idea of operating system monitoring is really broken down to 10 really detailed things you can work on. And from that, the last thing is a few other resources for you folks. You'll have the slides made available to you. So with that, I think we have a couple minutes left. Happy to take any questions.
Sean, thanks, Sean. So we did get one question in earlier when you were talking about data compromise about passwords, and you hit on it a little bit, but the question was, when will the industry change to a long password that only has to be changed every 6 months to a year? Then it would be a little bit harder to break.
Yeah, so as far when the industry will change, I'm not sure. I'm hopeful that it's soon. It tends to be that regulation and kind of compliance kind of lags behind technological developments. So that is one thing to note. From a best practice standpoint, you do have to balance what examiners and regulators are looking for. But the general industry is shifting to agree that, the passwords itself, if there's not any indication or suspicion that they've been compromised, the frequent rotations encourage very formulaic passwords, which overall are much weaker than creating one really strong password that you can use until there's an issue with it. If you're forced to change every month, the vast majority of your users are either using the month name or they're just simply incrementing, that last number on their password from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 until they can go back to 1. So that certainly is something, we're hopeful. One of the industry requirements that seems to be moving in this direction is PCI DSS version 4 is supposed to be released in the next few months. And that authentication piece was a big factor in some of the early communications around updating what their password requirements really looked like.
Great, thanks, Sean. And to piggyback on that, somebody had mentioned, better yet, what about passwordless logins? Is that a thing?
Yeah, it is. So Microsoft is actually making a really big push for the passwordless login. It would be nice, and I think generally, anytime we're shifting responsibility for security away from the end user who's not a security expert and to the people that are security experts, I'm generally in support of. I think there's going to be a lot of, I guess, road bumps on the way of deploying, the full Microsoft passwordless login. But I do like the idea of, like I said, taking security responsibility, away from an end user and putting that with the IT and security team. The cheesy joke I like to use, around that is, I work in security. I do not want to get a call at the end of the month from accounting to help them close the books for the month. So if that's my expectation, I don't know how much I can really expect for them to be security experts day in and day out.
Great, thanks, Sean. Our next question is referencing the fact that a lot of organizations have come up in support of not requiring a maximum password. And so I'm just reading through it right now to make sure that I'm hitting on all.
Yeah, so I've got this up now, so I think I can see it. So Azure AD Password Protect is the most common tool. Folks see it's actually an incredible resource that's made available for free and works really well. And the question is, if you're using a tool like that or some of the third-party options that make it technologically impossible for a user to use a weak password, can you move forward with that recommendation to remove the maximum password age? Partially, yes. The only thing that is a little bit difficult when it comes to Microsoft and that NIST password guidance is the way Microsoft stores their passwords. You can't meet all of the required statements of how NIST wants you to protect the password at the technology level. So the way the domain controllers store your passwords is essentially non-compliant with NIST. So you can't say, hey, we check all the boxes, we're going to follow this. That being said, you can get very close. You can do just about everything else other than that storage requirement, and might be able to make that case. But I do want to note, you can't be 100% in compliance with what NIST is looking for.
Wonderful. Thanks, Sean. I'm going to just leave it open for a minute or so. Just if anyone has any additional questions, feel free to start putting those into the Q&A for Sean or into the chat box, whichever is easier for you. Sean, all of Sean's information of his presentation and a link to this recording will become available after the event. So please feel free to forward to any colleagues who may benefit from hearing this presentation, and as well as, taking a peek back at the presentation, the PDF of it. So we'll give another second for, if you'd like to just take a picture of Sean's phone or email, feel free to contact him directly with any questions that you may have after the event concludes.
Yes, we had one more coming in.
Yeah, it looks like another one just came in.
Yep. So the idea of, if we remove that maximum password age, so that forced rotation, if we get rid of that, that's putting a lot of responsibility on the organization to identify when that password is compromised, and how often are we seeing folks where their passwords are compromised and the organization clearly wasn't aware. Yeah, and that's part of the struggle is the IT and security team needs to implement those technologies. So whether it's Azure AD Password Protect is a good start. There's some third-party alternatives to that specific tool, But you also need to be monitoring for breached credentials. So what else are you doing to look to see, is your user information out there? And that could be through, working with third parties to crawl through, kind of those attacker forums. It could be things like some of the more advanced monitoring around login activity. If a password is compromised, they're going to have to test that somewhere. And do you have the ability to actually detect when that is happening so you can start to respond? So I don't think there's, just one thing you can do to get rid of that maximum password age. There are, a lot of moving parts, and it does take work on the IT and security side to, mitigate those risks of this user's password, may live out there for a year. And are we able to detect if and when that is compromised?
Great. Thanks, Sean. I'm going to go ahead and